All right, let's take a look at the report that you have to upload into Canvas for the online activity 2. In this activity, you're asked to take a look at what possible errors in a reaction experiment that could occur and see if you can trace the effect they have on some main result. In this case, it's the amount of calcium carbonate within a Tums tablet. So here on this page, I have the part that you're going to upload into Canvas. It's pretty much 3 parts. Calculation is the first part, and the second part is prediction, and then the last part is analysis. So what you want to do pretty much is follow the directions, and that's it, I guess. But I want to talk to you about those parts. So here, the first part, I have calculations. So you're going to do what it says here on a piece of paper. You're going to write something like this, your name, of course, um, online activity 2, OLA2 report, calculations part A, and then just do these calculations. And these calculations here are pretty standard for an introductory chemistry laboratory like you'd find in Chem 200, where you're doing a acid-base analysis with titration, and the first thing you have to do is standardize your sodium hydroxide solution that you made up approximately, because sodium hydroxide pellets are hygroscopic, and the weight changes, so you can't get a real good weight. Therefore, you can't prepare a very accurate, with precision, concentration of sodium hydroxide. So you have to standardize it with something like KHP. So you're going to go through what it says here. You're going to write it out, and that's the calculation sections pretty much. You're just going to follow and do those calculations. And I don't think any of them are really that tough. You just have to add, subtract, multiply, and things like that to find your answers. um, and so that brings us all the way through here with these calculations that you're going to outline uh, and upload as part of your report. Now this one here for 9, it tells you to scale up the amount of calcium hydroxide that would have been found if you analyzed the whole sample instead of just part of the sample. And when you go through the calculations, you'll see that some of the sample of the tablet was lost, and you only analyzed like 84.17% of the sample. So for 9, you're going to have to scale that up and follow those directions here that that it says in this outline. So, for example, you're going to have to do some sort of a scale up here. I don't know why this is popping through. And that scale up calculation, you can do it as a ratio. So you say, okay, I used 84% of the sample, 84%. I should have used, well, 84.17. I should have used 100%. And I found using 84% that that sample contained 0.50, that was 0.5505 grams of calcium carbonate. And so how much would it have been for 100%, and then you can solve for X. And so that ought to give you a little help on answering that part. All right, now we get to the next part, which is the situation part. So somewhere in your piece of paper, whatever you're going to turn in, you put 2 and write situation, and then you're going to probably put situation 1, number 1, and then A is your prediction, right? So A, you say something like, I guess that the percent of calcium carbonate will be lower. And then B, they want to know why. Well, it's going to be lower because you use less KHP for situation 1. And then for C, they want you to estimate approximately how much lower. So I just put be less than 5% because you only used 2% lower KHP. So, it's a complete and total guess here. And then you go on to situation 2 and you answer A, B, and C again. Guess what will happen to the main result, percent calcium carbonate. B, why you think it's going to go up or down. And C, try to estimate the amount you think it's going to go up or down and why. So you're going to go through situation 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that would be this part of your report that you're going to upload. All right. What's next? And let's go down here. And the last part is the analysis. So you're going to look to the directions over here for analysis and wrap up and follow them. And what you're going to hand in is something like this. Number 3, analysis. Part A, you're to use the Excel spreadsheet that's provided and check out your calculations to make sure that you calculated them properly. And then just go through it, and if there's any difference in your calculations versus the spreadsheet, then just fix your calculations like I did here in this example. Say you calculated 1.357 grams of calcium carbonate, but you found there was a calculator error or whatever. So just cross it out. You don't even have to redo it. Just put a slash through your calculations and put the true value now that you see that you made that error, and you picked out the true value from the spreadsheet. All right, now the next part, B here, says check your predictions for each of the situations using the spreadsheet. And so I wanted to show you what that would be like. So for the first situation, which is right here, situation 1, it says during sodium hydroxide standardization, part C, the mass of KHP is recorded and measured, but 2% of the KHP was lost when transferred from weigh boat to Erlenmeyer flask. Okay, so you have 2% less. Now, how can I use the spreadsheet to tell me what would happen? And this is kind of the power of this. And it allows you to get a better feel for what errors would be like. So when you write a conclusion that includes a critical analysis of your main results, in other words, what were they, what's your percent error, and why do you think that there was error in there, you don't have to just make up stuff that you did maybe in Chem 200. Here you can actually say, well, I over titrated and then you guesstimate the amount you over titrated, say, a half a milliliter, and then you can go through your calculations and see how much that changed your results, and then show that that was the same magnitude that you were in error and the same direction, too high or too low. And that'll give you some confidence that indeed that was a possible error that could have affected your result by that amount. So that's kind of the purpose of this lab, is to make you not only aware of what errors could occur, but whether they were important or not in your main value that you were reported, or the main purpose of the lab. All right, so to show that 2% less KHP was actually transferred, we can go to the Excel spreadsheet, and this is the calculations part. So you're going to go through, look at this, and check your calculations and correct your calculations if they're wrong. And then the situations part is the same as your calculations part, except now you can start changing this and see what the overall change or the overall effect would be in the mass of calcium carbonate in the Tums tablet, as well as the percent error, based off of the belief that there should be 660 milligrams of calcium carbonate in each Tums tablet. Okay. All right, so here's some of the experimental input up here in part C, D, E, and F on both sides here. So I see that here's my mass of KHP. In situation 1, it says that it's going to be 2% less. So I can change my spreadsheet by multiplying this value times 0.98, because that's 2% less than 100. And so when I return, that changes my whole spreadsheet. And the bottom line's down here. The experimental mass of calcium carbonates in the Tums tablet decreases to 641.3 milligrams, and the percent error increases from about 0.8 to 2.8. So what I want to do then is I want to go back and put in those results in this table that they provided for us. And so I put in any changes that makes here, like 641.3 is the new mass of the calcium carbonate in the Tums, and the percent error increased to 2.8. And then I can go back and say, because down here it wants you to put in a sentence or two talking about what you predicted and what came out, and so I put here for situation 1, I predicted that the amount would be lower by less than 5%, and it was 2.8%. So the change was only about 2%. So my prediction was correct, and I guess I got lucky. And so you're going to go to the next situation, and then the next, and continue this. And after you finish part 3, the analysis, then you just have to upload those 3 parts into Canvas for grading. So again, those 3 parts where part 1 was calculation, part 2 prediction, and part 3 analysis. So that should get you going in the right direction on this report.